Hey guys, Ruben, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to the Chatting With series. I'm so happy to chat with my next guest, Garland Dunlap, who is what we like to call the resident theologian at our church. Garland is actually our Director of Spiritual and Leadership Development. Garland, it's great to have you on. How are you doing today?
Doing well. It is great to be here. I just want to say I appreciate you, and I just want to honor you for providing this platform. I think this is amazing.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Garland. Tell us about your background. You've obviously got a degree in theology, so I guess let's just start with that.
Yeah, so from an educational standpoint, I attended Dallas Theological Seminary, graduated with 2 degrees, 2 masters, one in biblical studies and one in Christian education. For those nerds who are following, I really did a deep dive into theological method. So I would describe myself as a teacher first and a theologian second. I'm an educator who thinks very hard about how theology applies to the field of education. So in reality, theology is a secondary pursuit, but it's definitely a first love amongst other things. At church, title is Director of Spiritual and Leadership Development. I say I'm the pipes behind the walls. And just giving honor to our pastors, Earl and Onika, I think they've seen the need for both a strategic level of how we develop spiritually and also a specific level on how we communicate ideas to people. And so that's kind of what I do. I describe my role again as the pipes behind the walls. You don't see a lot of what I do on a Sunday morning, but if you think about it, when you flush the toilet, it just happens, and it's not until it gets clogged that you're like, oh, there's a problem here. So I'm a plumber. I make sure the pipes are flowing. And then I am a husband and a father. I'd say, honestly, my theology is probably most impacted by my relationships with my child and with my wife. I always tease people. My teaching journey, especially in like kind of Sunday school Christian circles, started as a Sunday school teacher. And I remember teaching a lesson on grace and doing the research, and I was like, oh, okay, I understand grace. And then I got engaged, and then I understood grace. And then I got married, and then I understood grace. And then I had a child, and then I understood grace. And so I always laugh and tease, because I think a lot of concepts you can definitely learn. And I'm not, for a guy, I always say I'm overeducated. I have more education than I will ever do anything with. And so I value education, but I also don't mistake education from the lived experience. I don't mistake the difference between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. They're connected, but they are different things. So that's a lot of the educational side in a nutshell.
All right, so break those 2 terms down. What do you mean?
Excellent. Okay. Simple version is orthodoxy is right thought, orthopraxy is right action. So distinguishing in the context of like the Bible, we think a lot of orthodoxy as, hey, here are the right doctrines, here are the way we should understand scripture, here's the right way to think about things. But I think if you stop there and you're not putting that into practice, then there's clearly a disconnect. And so putting that into practice is orthopraxy. Actually, I know in terms of the topic we're talking about, if you're thinking about slavery as an institution,
Hold on. Let me set the table for that one. We haven't got quite there yet.
All right, so. Never mind. Well, then let me use a different example. Marriage. Okay, so I think we can know all the Bible verses, right? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. But I think if you're yelling at your wife on a regular basis, there is a difference between what you know and what you're putting into practice, which means that there's some disconnect that's happening. And so your orthodoxy, your belief, has to match up with the way you live life. That's the simple version.
Okay. Well, and since you let the cat out of the bag, let's
Sorry.
segue to that. No, I'll good. I'll good. Let's segue to that for a second. So, right, my channel, I have a big heart for apologetics, but I want to be clear. Like, I don't like doing what I would call make apologetics. Right, I'm not trying to have apologetics in a box. I just have this strong heart to defend my faith, and having been an atheist, like I'm very familiar with some of just those casual skeptical arguments. And one of the big ones, right, that I could tell you that I had as a skeptic was I felt that I had that kind of self-righteous indignation against God, believe it or not, and there's that kind of, especially in the West, that general scrutiny against what people would say is God's morality moral, right? And when we get to the topic of slavery, then it's the big question is, well, God seems to endorse slavery in the Old Testament. And so how can you call God moral when we all know how awful slavery was, especially when we think about chattel slavery in the United States, right? And so the things I guess I kind of want to just set the table with and let you unpack a little bit is, right, if we think of Leviticus, well, first, if we just think that bigger picture, right? God clearly, in my view anyway, God had something to say about slavery clearly, which was, I don't endorse that. I'm going to liberate this people group out of hard slave, what we call hard slavery. I mean, these people were definitely like treated in a not good way. They were used as forced labor, if nothing else, if not chattel, definitely that. And God's like, no, you're going to let my people go. And he did the 10 plagues and all of that kind of fun stuff. But then once he establishes his nation, he starts setting up some rules in Leviticus. And the ones I kind of want you to touch on, Garland, is if we think of Leviticus 25, right, there's a couple interesting sections starting in 25:42, where God's essentially kind of reiterating what I just said, where he's like, well, I brought you guys out of bondage. You guys are my people. So Israelites must not be slaves. But then what I think is interesting, just 2 verses later in 25:44, he's like, but if you go to other nations around you, you may go ahead and buy those people as slaves. And then in 46, he's like, and oh, by the way, you can consider this inherited property down to your children. And it's like, whoa, slow down. Am I reading this right? So help me out here, Garland. What are we actually like seeing here?
Yeah, so I think so I'm going to assume a couple of people in your audience. I'm going to assume probably there's a person in your audience who honestly they're bought in. And so I don't know that they're like, hey, I believe the Bible. I'm down for this. I'm good. And then I think there's probably somebody in your audience who's like, yeah, that's a good point. I don't really get that. There's probably some other positions, but I'm going to assume those 2 people in the audience. And I'm not necessarily going to rehash any of the arguments. There are plenty of them out there. A simple Google search, if you're genuinely curious, you can find them. So I'm not necessarily going to come at it. I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle. And that is,
that's totally cool. And that's why I try to personalize it, because ultimately I want this to stay focused on how I was perceiving it and how I've changed as a Christian, for sure. So yeah,
absolutely. And I want to do honor to the people who make the arguments well. While I appreciate apologetics, and I think deep down every Christian comes from an apologetic position in the sense of being able to explain why you believe what you believe. I'm probably not as versed in the apologetic arguments as other people. There are people who definitely understand them better. Where I'm actually going to come from is more of a theological interpretive perspective. That's kind of, so I'm just laying my groundwork in terms of my starting point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Go for it.
Awesome. So I think the first thing I'm going to say is, you'll hear this phrase, it's a common phrase, that the Bible is a manual for living. And I think that's a wonderful idea. And I think it's a misreading. I don't think it's the best way to approach the Bible. I don't think it's the best way to approach scripture. So theologically, I would suggest that the Bible is the revelation of God. So this is one of the means by which God explains to us who he is. And it's done in a very particular way. So to use kind of conceptual metaphors, God inspired, so God moved on people's hearts throughout time and space to write some things in the context in which they were living. Sometimes it carried his very directives, and other times it was them making commentary or observations on what was happening around them. So in the case of a lot of the prophets, you're probably looking at, if not the words of God, definitely the specific things that God wanted to speak to in that context, especially with the minor prophets. You can run the minor prophets in parallel with the historical books of the Bible, and you'll see like, oh, this thing happened, and now this prophet is commentary on it. It's almost like they're doing color commentary, like if there's a sports game going on and you've got the announcers doing color commentary, that's what the prophets are doing. So they're commenting on the historical events. When it comes to the Torah, we would understand that to be, okay, these are laws in part that are handed down by God, but understand that the Torah, you have all of these kind of directives or prescriptive announcements or things like that, and in between them are all these stories, okay? So you've got God said do this, and then you've got these stories of people doing stuff. All right, so that's just basic idea. And so the Torah or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, that's usually their structure. You look plenty of outlines there and you'll see that structure. So then I think there are times where the Bible is prescribing a thought and idea. So the way I would understand Leviticus is these laws are part of the covenant, the contract that God is making between the Israelites and himself in terms of dictating terms and conditions and behaviors and ideas that he wants them to follow. One of the ways I would also suggest we think about as we interpret Leviticus, as we interpret the law, is a lot of times God will give a statement, a very clear statement. This is what I want you to do. This is not what I want you to do. But it doesn't cover every scenario. Some things are a little bit more thorough than others. I was actually reading in Leviticus and it's talking about who you should have sexual relations with. And it's kind of funny because he's like, you know, don't have sex with your mom and your sister and your cousin. And, you know, and so it's very particular. I was just like, huh, that's kind of detailed. But then other times he'll just give one thing and then just leave it there. And so if you look, even from a non-Christian perspective, if you look at Jewish history and how the Jews have used that, they've always understood it as, okay, God gave this command, but then it's up to us to kind of extrapolate how this fits when there's scenarios that don't specifically fit this command. So that was kind of always an understood. And so as a Christian, as somebody who believes that Jesus is Messiah, and so therefore I follow Christ, and so I'm a little Christ, I'm a Christian. As a Christian, the way I look at that is very similar. I don't necessarily understand Leviticus to cover every scenario, but I do understand Leviticus to be laying down a set of principles to follow. That's how I understand it. And so here's the specific example. Okay, now it's up to you to apply that in your day-to-day living. And then what I also see, so then you've got all these stories that are surrounding all these laws, especially in the first 5 books of the Bible. And so partly what I understand those, and even later on, when you see some of the other historical books, is I understand those stories to be there as a way of showing like, yeah, so here's what happens when you follow the law, and here's what happens when you don't follow the law. And it's up to you to make a determination. I'll throw out an example. Polygamy doesn't seem to be endorsed in the book of Leviticus. And yet you have these historical examples of all these kings who very much engage in polygamy. But here's what I would throw out there. When you read their stories, does polygamy work out well for them, or does it work out poorly for them? Because it seems to me that marrying multiple wives ends badly for most of them, all of them. Yeah. Now, do good things come out of it? we get the 12 tribes of Israel out of polygamy.
Well, and that's certainly a great example, right? Is
Yeah.
God doesn't endorse it, and he's not necessarily specifically omitting it. So in an ambiguous situation, we see it in its application that it kind of leads to a not good end result. But again, let's not get too far away from Leviticus. I'm going to hold you to it, Garland, right? He seems to be like, no, I liberated you. I don't like it, but here you go. It's okay. Like he has something almost implying that it's okay. And that's kind of what I wanted to make sure you have an opportunity as, as a professional studier of the word, essentially, right? What should we take from the Leviticus 25?
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's the, I don't want to seem like I'm stalling, but there's definitely like a drill down. We got to see the bigger picture before we dive into the minutia. You got to see the forest before you look at the bark. And so let me just start out by acknowledging this is a hard passage, especially from our perspective. And I'll definitely acknowledge, or rather kind of say that I think some of our perspective on slavery is marred by our view of chattel slavery in this century, or in this half of as opposed to the BC, and kind of understanding how slavery functioned there. Not making excuses for the institution, but we do need to view them slightly differently. One of the things in terms of, especially with the African-American, or rather African experience, and the transatlantic slavery experience, is one of the key differences is, and you see this in writings, there's this discussion of whether Africans have souls, whether Africans can be Christians, whether they're a lesser form of human being. There's this long historical story of justifying slavery because Africans are lesser versions of human, if they're human at all. And so that's the justification. So then it's that lens that then gets applied to our understandings of Leviticus. So when you're looking at justifications for slavery, and particularly this passage, they've got this understanding of, well, Africans don't have souls. Now I apply that to here, and now the reason why I'm doing slavery is because we're actually trying to redeem these people, and this is a way of getting the laziness out of them. That's actually an argument that's made. But I don't think that the hearers of Leviticus would have understood it that way. And in fact, I would argue that I think God is actually trying to create a system in which people are still honored. There's a couple of groups of people that are specifically mentioned in the law: slaves, foreigners, Levites, widows, and orphans. They're all specific. They all get specific mention in the law, throughout the law. And we remember, we're drilling down to this passage. So they all get specific mention in the law. Well, why? Because they can't own land. They can't own land, or they don't have a direct attachment to somebody who owns land. And so they get special treatment in the law to make sure that they get the dignity that they deserve. And so I think that what's happening is, I think there's just an acknowledgement that slavery exists in that ancient Near Eastern world that's happening in the law. And I do think that in context, if you're looking at being enslaved in Hebrew lands versus being enslaved in other lands, it's a different experience. Now, so now we're going to get very specifically into this passage. And I noticed you started to jump in. Before we dive in, did you want to add anything to that? All right, sweet. So I think when we're looking at this passage, which basically says, I'm reading from the NIV, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So a couple of things here that I see. Number one, I don't see forced slavery. So I don't see a directive from God to go and kidnap people from their lands and force them to relocate to remove their identity from them and to force them to breed and to create a system where people are born into slavery and remain there for life. So if you look at some of the other laws, this whole slaves for life thing was a voluntary thing that some people did that was usually connected to debt. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, I would say, even though the word is slave, and I think that's the best translation of it, I think the better thought would be servant in terms of its application. That somebody who sold themselves into slavery was more like, so my wife and I love Downton Abbey. And so they were more like the butler, both in function and in terms of how they fit into the household. So if you look at in Downton Abbey, the way the servants function, they're really members of the household. Now there is a social standing that's there, but they're members of the household. And I'd say, and that would be the difference is in Leviticus, from a social standpoint, being enslaved does not mark you as somehow lesser of social standing. You're of equal dignity under the law. And that gets carried forth into the New Testament. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Well, I was just going to chime in that I have noticed the word used interchangeably. It depends on the version of the translation that you get. But like another kind of interesting one between interchangeability of servant and slave is, we go back to Abraham. Like yes. Some translations refer to Hagar as a slave. Some refer to as Sarah's servant. So I just find it interesting that that this word is a very strong word, and to be specifically associated, even if we think of that context, that there's the argument that the child that Hagar birthed essentially birthed a lesser people group, essentially, if we apply the slave context all the way downward. And so that's why I just think it's such a strong word, and yet it is used over 188 times if I do a casual reference in Bible Gateway search. And so
right.
we need to definitely unpack what the heck does this word mean? What does the Old Testament say this word means, right? So
and so that's the problem when you're jumping from one language to another, is that connotation doesn't always get carried over. So I think there's connotations about the word slave in Hebrew that don't get carried, or that in English we have some ideas attached to that as a word that Hebrew doesn't necessarily carry. So the issue with in any translator is when you're making a decision to go from one language to another, what do you carry over? Do you carry over the word as it was written, or do you carry over the idea of the word? And this is where, footnote, this is where you get thought for thought versus word for word translation. I'm not here to say which one's better. This is one of the actual arguments as to why you should do original language study, because you're able to kind of peer under the hood and see what's happening there. So going back to this Leviticus passage, remember, somebody who chooses to be a slave for life, it's a voluntary, it's not a mandatory thing. So it's not something you can force on someone else. It's something that someone chooses to take for themselves. And you'll see that elsewhere in Leviticus. But the other thing that I would actually point out is earlier in the passage, they're talking about the year of Jubilee. Verse 13, in the year of Jubilee, everyone is to return to their own property. So
I definitely love that part about Jubilee where, God does say, hey, by the way, every 7 years, you got to set these people free. So I felt
the reset button.
I felt that was definitely to help the argument where people are like, well, this is more like an indentured servant, and God's definitely setting up rules to say, hey, look, ultimately people are people, and even them, you've got to, restore their equality back. But while I've tracked that and I follow that, and ultimately I'm grounded in the new perspective of his ways are higher than my ways, his thoughts are higher than my thoughts, and if I don't get it, it's probably just because it's a limitation of how we see it down in our level, not because God's immoral. But again, I guess let's try to park this thing by saying, what about Leviticus 25:46, where he's saying you can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. And I'm like,
Well,
okay,
well,
what do you
because
make of that?
yeah, so what I would make of that is the year of Jubilee. Even though I understand what the words say, and this is not contradictory, this idea of slaves for life, the year of Jubilee says, even if you sign up for slave for life, you're not a slave for life, because when the year of Jubilee hits, everybody gets released.
Oh,
So
really?
if you're actually following the year of Jubilee, if you're actually following the law, you still get released. There's still freedom.
So you're saying the 2546 passage is overridden by Jubilee?
Yes.
I didn't. Oh, see, this is why we bring you on, because I did not know that.
And that's, so I know I've been long-winded. I know I've kind of, it feels like I'm meandering, but what I'm doing is hopefully is kind of getting contextually down so you can see it, is there's a bunch of other things going on that are all interacting with one another. And if you're reading that passage by itself, it's like, well, yeah, that's really bad. That seems really mean. But if you read it in context of what else is going on, there's actually, and again, I'm not here to endorse slavery. And I don't think the Bible is there to endorse slavery. But what I do think is happening is within this context of something very bad and evil going on, God has created a provision for people to come out of it. And I think, so the escape hatch is the year of Jubilee. Now, so the other question that's attached here is, so why would we treat foreigners different than Jews? And I think the context there, because if you keep looking in this very same chapter, what it's really attached to is if I'm a poor Israelite and I have a bad harvest, there's a plague, there's a fungus in my crop, but it wipes out my farmland. I can sell you my farmland because I need to feed my family. And then I can choose to sell myself so that way I can work the land and you can pay me. But there's a provision where I can buy that land back from you and you're obligated to sell it back to me. There's an obligation in the law there. And that ownership of land is not, so if you're a foreigner, you don't have that same provision for owner of land, which is why you can inherit, because remember in that economy, pretty much the only way you made money is if you were attached to land. That's why owning land was so important. But a foreigner could not own land. So if they needed to make any money, their choices were to beg or to sell themselves into slavery if you were a foreigner living in Israel, because you couldn't own property as a foreigner living in Israel. So the selling into slavery for life is actually a provision for the foreigner because it allows them to still have income.
Wow. And this is a topic we could spend 2 hours on and get lost in it, but
yeah.
and
I would say, if I could bottom line this, what I would say is, I don't think the Bible endorses slavery. I think there's, this is a book that I've recommended to people. I think probably 75 to 85% I agree with. There's probably a 25 to 15% I disagree with, but it's the title is Slaves, Women, and Homosexuality. And he talks about a redemptive hermeneutic. His argument is that there are certain things in the Bible that if you look over the arc of time, what you see is God is actually working towards something. So he specifically mentioned slavery, and his argument is if you actually look at kind of verses on slavery throughout in its development throughout Scripture, there's this clear arc of, no, this is something that needs to go away. That's his argument in a nutshell. It's more complicated than that because they always are. But I would say, I think if you're looking at slavery in context in the Bible, it does seem like it's moving towards something which is ultimately freedom. That's the bottom
good,
line.
Bro. That's good. Wow. We spent so much time on this. There was a couple other, for instance, that I wanted to cover, but I think you did such a great job just unpacking this for me, Garland. I thank you so much. If you kind of had like a 2-minute in closing, what would you want to tell people, maybe starting with the church or just in general? How would you recommend people maybe study the Bible on their own?
Yeah, that's a good question. Man, 2 minutes. Okay. I think the first thing is don't study it on your own. Now, here's what I mean by that. If you look at pretty much every cult, every Christian variant, it starts with someone going, every Christian understanding of the Bible is wrong, and I'm going to figure it out on my own. And I'm going to politely but firmly say, if you think that you're the only person in 2,000 years of Christian history to read the Bible correctly, I'm going to kindly suggest to you that you might be overvaluing your intellect. That I don't, while there's definitely over time, changes of understanding, refinement of understanding, articulation of doctrine, I would say, I don't know that anybody's ever come up with anything new on their own in Christianity. It's always been a conversation in conversation with the community of faith. And while we definitely have polite disagreements, and while we definitely have family fights, I think a lot of the fundamentals Christians have been able to agree with over time, and throughout time and space. There's been a lot of things where Christians are like, nope, like we might disagree on this particular point, but there are certain points that we've kind of always said, yeah, that's what we believe. And if you're Christian, these are the ones you got to sign up on. If you don't want to believe those fine, just don't call yourself Christian. So I would say, don't read the Bible on your own. Read it in the context of community. That's the big one, I would say.
Amen, amen. Well, thank you so much again for coming on, Garland. It was such a pleasure to have you on. God bless you, brother.
God bless you too. I appreciate the honor of having me on, and I look forward to maybe digging into some of those other questions at a different time.
Yeah, maybe we'll have a part 2 session someday.
Yeah.
God bless you guys.
God bless you.
All right, gang, that's it for this episode. If you like my content, please consider subscribing to my channel. God bless you guys.